Hello, everyone. So, since today's guest comes with a Spanish educational background, not Hispanic, but a Spanish educational background, I thought it would be appropriate to start with a blooper in Spanish. And it's a sign both in Spanish and English, which says very simply, prohibido arrollar nada dentro del sanitario, which should be translated, it's prohibited to throw anything in the toilet. And instead, the English translation, it says, it is forbidden to throw nothing down the toilet, which is, of course, very descriptive. And what happens with double negatives and so forth. So today's guest is Ramsey Pryor. Ramsey is the founder of Port of Entry Partners, a strategic consultancy that helps software companies expand and thrive in international markets. From market sizing and prioritization to product localization to building up world-class teams and partner ecosystems and scaling up revenue, Ramsey and his team apply the frameworks and best practices used by the fastest growing software companies and help you avoid costly mistakes. Prior to founding Port of Entry Partners, Ramsey was a software executive at Branch, IBM, Outblaze, and Register.com, and is a multi-time startup founder and entrepreneur. Ramsey has a BA in Economics and Hispanic Studies from Northwestern University and earned a bilingual MBA from ESA in Barcelona. He also hosts the International Expansion podcast, which covers the best practices and lessons learned the hard way by some of the best-known software companies. Welcome, Ramsey. Delighted you can join us.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So let's start with, as your bio talks about, what are some of the best practices in the software field when it comes to going into international markets?
Well, Philip, I've been in software for pretty much my whole career. And when I started, there was something that was referred to as the waterfall method of software development, which basically was if you were going to build an application or some sort of a software product, you had somebody whose job it was to write a really long document about everything that it should do and how it should behave. And when that person was done, they'd hand that over to a design team who would figure out what the screen should look like and design it. And then that team, when they were done, would hand it over to a bunch of software engineers to go and build it. And then some number of months or even in some cases years later, the thing would come out. And no surprise, there were a lot of things that people had never considered that it doesn't do or doesn't do well. And that was the waterfall method. And then, fortunately for everybody, a new methodology came around called agile. And agile methodology is really the opposite of that in many ways, where instead of building one big monolithic thing in sequence, you build really small pieces and you have your cross-functional team working together instead of separately and throwing things over the wall. And the good news about that was it built in time to make improvements along the way and to figure out, okay, now that we've seen it and we've touched it and we've used it, what should come next? And that allows you to fix things that didn't work, allowed you to insert new ideas that you hadn't even thought of before, and just play a lot more scenarios through the software before it was considered done. And that was a huge leap forward for just software in general. But what I think that the best practices, what I've seen that is happening in terms of how software companies go international is very much in that same vein. 10 years ago, if a company was doing really well in the US or in their home market, they would hit this threshold where they would say, hey, we're doing so well here. Why don't we take this show on the road? And US companies would often start thinking about maybe putting an office in Canada or, ooh, wow, maybe even an office in London or in Ireland or in Australia if you're really adventurous. These days, software companies are thinking about that from the very start. And rather than putting these big monolithic structures in locations and hoping that all their estimates and their forecasts were correct, you can do things in much smaller pieces. You can test the waters before you make really big investments, and you can let the data tell you where to double down or where to pause or where to retreat, rather than trying to make all those predictions up front. So in a nutshell, I would say that thought process and methodology is the big picture of best practices for international expansion in software.
So it's partially the modular approach. I know software developers create the modules that they piece together, and then also they go into countries and then let the data decide or tell them where to expand into, where to go from there.
That's right. And I think that taking that philosophy down a level into more the day-to-day, there's things that companies that do this the best build into the product up front. So they put the plumbing to be international in, even before they're in 10 languages. They're ready for that. And that's something that is a definite best practice and what's often referred to as internationalization. It's building that capability for that. And from a stack perspective, usually software companies these days are put together like Legos. So they don't build a payment system and they don't build all the things that plug in. They choose pieces that will work together. And upfront, if you know and anticipate that you're going to be in multiple markets and taking many currencies and available in many languages, you would build your stack a certain way from the beginning to optimize for a future state where you are in multiple markets. And you can even do that from an operational perspective. When you think about growing your team, one of the questions I always ask clients is, in 10 years, assuming everything goes as well as you hope, what % of your business, your revenue, your customers, your end users do you expect will be, at the continent level? How many will be in the Americas? How many will be in Europe? How many will be in Asia? And these days, I never hear any company saying, well, the majority of any of those things is going to be in my home market. Even US companies anticipate, if what they're doing is actually global, that maybe the US is worth 40% of all things in the fullness of time, or maybe 50%, but it's not 80%. And if you know that going up front and you really internalize that, then as you build your product, as you build your team, as you build your stack, you'd probably do some things differently to prepare for that.
Yeah, that's very true. And that's very unique, actually, in most businesses, that software companies seem very forward thinking and thinking international to begin with and preparing for that to begin with. As you know, I run a language translation and localization firm, and very rarely now let me change that. We do get clients who come to us, of course, can you localize our website, or can you translate this software, whatever. And very rarely we find that there are programs that are designed that simply cannot be localized. You can't extract the text, and the plumbing is not there to put it in other languages. So it's wonderful to know that most software companies do think of this in advance, because many firms in other industries do not think of those pieces in advance, of course. I guess one of the questions I would want to ask is, what happens when these practices are not followed? But it seems that these practices are generally followed now. So perhaps that doesn't apply. But I suppose then I could ask, what kind of mistakes companies have made when they develop international software?
Well, I wish it was the case that all companies thought completely global from the start and they didn't have these problems or consequences. But I come across very few companies that do it all up front, or make those investments all up front. The best companies will do a couple of those, but it's really interesting talking company to company to see who's really good at which piece of this and the most forward thinking. But in terms of building the internationalization plumbing up front, plenty of companies don't do that. Or there are companies that have been around for a while that are only now expanding, that are realizing the need for it. And I've been in that situation myself. And the pain point that you run into then is you have to ask your product team to halt the presses for 4 or 6 months to go and build that plumbing in. And at that point, that's an expensive ask. There's a lot of things, new features that people are waiting for. There's customer requests for years, list a mile long of those types of things. And to get that prioritized is really, really hard. And so either you're putting a lot of things on hold to go and do that, or you have these arguments about, well, why don't we just use Google Translate and call it a day? And, people who are out in the field know that it's not that simple. So, something suffers as a result, and it's much better to do it up front. And I think in terms of operations, the consequence of not thinking ahead are, you often end up with massive teams that are really based in wherever you started, but they're being asked to support multiple regions as you become international. And so, as a result, people are staying up late, or, people are getting support from a region that, they don't really, if the people they're talking to are not located there, they're not going to do as good a job supporting them. They don't understand the local context. People always want to talk to someone who's in their region and speaks their language, and is contextually in the same ballpark. And I think that if a company is thinking well ahead and knows, look, I hope to have customers in Europe and in Asia, well, maybe as you're building your support team or your inside sales team or the team that can really be anywhere, you might as well go ahead and start taking advantage of the global marketplace, of spreading your team out a little bit so that they can support multiple time zones from the beginning. And by the way, those people can also give you great insight into the markets that you're going to be going into. They can tell you what competition looks like. They can tell you about local pricing. They can tell you about so many things that are very difficult to detect by reading reports or flying in every so often.
Yeah, that's very true. One of the first rules of international business, which a lot of people don't think about, is to have the support teams in country, or in at least on the same continent. You can launch something in Portuguese for Portugal, but at least have a support center somewhere in the European Union, because it's the same time zone and so forth. And a lot of companies that go internationally don't think of this. And, it's like you buy furniture from IKEA or something and try to assemble it, and the instructions are in Chinglish. And why can't you call someone in Taiwan to figure out why this is poorly translated and how does this really go together? So
Indeed.
Something obvious that most people don't consider. So it's wonderful that a lot of software companies do think of it now. The other parts of software globalization basically is internationalization and globalization and acculturation. And what I found in the language business, that these are words that are very misused, or if not misunderstood, that's certainly used in different ways, and that people define the terms in different ways. So how would you define these terms of internationalization and globalization, for example?
Probably poorly, because I know that companies such as yours, you guys know this, and I probably butcher these terms, but I'll actually give credit to Natalie Kelly, who has a great blog on this. She's head of international over at HubSpot, and she has burned these simple ways of thinking about these terms into my head. So when I think of globalization, I think of framework. When I think of internationalization, that's your code layer. And when I think of localization, that's really the product experience. And the translation is when you're adapting the message. And so, I don't know if those definitions resonate with you. I do appreciate that people look at these terms differently, but that's my cheat sheet. And that's the way I think about them.
That's fine, as long as it works and you all are communicating and understand each other. I was laughing earlier because as you were talking about the ways of building software, I was thinking of a wonderful town that I used to live in Southern Africa. I lived there for 2 years. The town is called Mabato, Mmabatho. And the town was growing so fast that literally houses were popping up almost overnight. I would drive along a road, and a week later, I have a detour because I was driving through someone's living room, or would have driven through someone's living room. There was now a house there. And what I found was that it was delightful to see all the development, but then the town planners conveniently forgot to put in the sewers. and they had to tear up all of the roads that they had paved to, you know, put in the sewer lines and then connect them to the houses. So it's, you know, one of these situations, you're growing so fast, and what do you think of? And then, oops, go back and do some basics there.
It's a literal consequence of exactly what we're talking about. But yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I also see happening is just not being aware of, you know, time zones. And I've worked in tech from a lot of different locations, and I noticed that somebody's always in the dark. Someone's always working in the off hours. It's inevitable if we sleep 8 hours and you're covering, you know, three time zones or sleep zones. And you know, what I've noticed is that from the West Coast, it's actually very easy to work with a lot of Asia. And Europe it's a little more difficult to have that overlap. From the East Coast, you know, you're especially East Coast companies, they find it very easy to work with London and that headquarters and to fly back and forth. But Asia, the connection with Asia tends to be often in off hours and
Right.
unfortunate in some ways. So I think that's the other thing to kind of consider up front is, you know, which groups and teams and regions need to be talking to each other, and are you making the investments and in terms of where you put people that are going to make that easy or hard. And it's a simple thing to understand the time zone issue, but in practice it's one of the most painful things.
Yeah, very true. And of course, from the West Coast, our our morning is tomorrow afternoon there. So always count on that they've already had their sleep, and hopefully they're wide awake by now.
They're seeing the future for you.
They're seeing the future, exactly. Are your clients mainly B2B or B2C? And do you advise your clients to acculturate for specific countries? You've mentioned this to some extent, but can you give us some examples of how they've acculturated for different countries?
So I have clients that are both B2B and B2C. My personal experience is a lot deeper on the B2B side. And I think generalizing, I would say that B2B companies have an easier time of going into new markets. Especially for software companies, if you're selling to a technical audience, a lot of engineers and product people are used to reading documents and dealing with websites that are in English. And even Apple, I think a lot of their documentation is only in English. So they've kind of trained the world that you're going to have to read technical docs in English. You can get a lot farther in those around the world in English if you're selling to businesses, I would say. If you're putting a consumer-centric product into a global market, I think that is a lot trickier and requires a lot more acculturation or localization. And it's very difficult. I think the exact same product, it's not just a matter of language, but it's cultural context that is going to decide whether a communication tool is adopted by a group. A lot of that is hard to understand, you know, and I, having launched my own product into the world via the app stores, it was puzzling why certain parts of the world were loving your product and other parts were not at all. And it was very actually interesting and challenging to unpack why that would be. So I think it's a lot harder. One best practice that I heard of a company that launched during the pandemic. So yeah, they had no option but to kind of launch it as a completely remote company, and they launched it globally, was they took as much language out of the actual interface and the experience as possible. And so rather than putting words and trying to explain things via words of how it works and what to do, they made it incredibly graphical. They made heavy use of emoji and imagery, and took as much verbiage out of it. And I think that was brilliant. And they even were able to penetrate markets that most people think are the hardest, like Korea and Japan. They got a lot of adoption there up front. I think that a lot of the credit goes to the fact that they took language out out of the picture and removed it as a factor. So that was pretty interesting to me. But I would say that, yeah, B2B companies can get a lot further with less localization. When you're going into Europe, your team's always going to ask for it. And, the places that it seems to matter most is France and in Germany. But I think you can get a lot done and treat that as kind of once you have the traction and the business case, that can come a bit later. But I don't think you can do that when you're B2C.
Well, speaking of languages, I know one of the issues, because we've translated for software, one of the issues is the character limits within a certain field. And a German word, for example, is this long, and an English word is that long, short. And how do you make the big German word fit into the small character limited field when German does not abbreviate very well? So what other kinds of language issues have you encountered, especially with B2C companies?
That example you have is really great. And I think it's eye-opening and a lot of people don't think about. There's so much information that you're displaying in tables. And those tables were built really with probably English or one language in mind. And you're right, if you put German in there, you put Dutch, or you put maybe a right to left character set in there, you'll realize that your design doesn't work. And there are some solutions out there that will allow you to test things like tables and word wrapping and things like that. So that's a best practice that I actually became aware of just recently, but makes tons of sense. I think the other things are, a lot of people will remember or are aware up front that date formats and things like that are, of course, different. But if you're taking payments, the way that people put address information in may or may not make any sense in another place. Again, like I would treat that as a Lego piece rather than trying to build and figure out all these things out the hard way, wherever you can. So using a payment processor that does all of that for you and is already available in the locations that have weird address formats or that accept currencies that you never want to have to go and build for, it's probably worth doing that up front. And I was trying to think, there was one example that a friend of mine over at Shopify gave of the way that forms worked in Japan that were so different. But I would just say, I think the best practice here is think about the markets you want to go into and make sure that you're getting someone who's local to that language, local to that culture, giving you feedback before you could declare done on your user interface. Otherwise, you're just going to have problems later.
Exactly. When we first started over 30 years ago, this was not a software product, but it was a consumer catalog for girls' clothing. And the company asked us to translate it. The software didn't exist back then, or not in this case. And the company asked us to translate it into Japanese, and they had 4 spaces for like refer a friend. Well, one of the first things we had to tell the client, and this is acculturation or localization, is that you never do 4 of anything for Japanese, Korean, or Chinese, because the word for, the word for sounds exactly like the word for death. It's like in English, see and see, or there, and there. So you never have 4 of anything. You have 3, you have 5, but you never have 4.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So, yeah. So that's just another tip for your clients as well. What are some of the largest difficulties? You have alluded to this, but what are some of the largest difficulties that software firms typically face when they enter international markets? Is it the software itself? Is it the marketing? Is it the support? Or is it something else?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all those. I'd say the biggest, highest level problem that you have is knowing what to expect. Going into a new market, it's always going to be harder than your home market, not easier. And there's sort of a discount that needs to be applied to what your addressable market is based on how much you are not catering to the local audience. And I think that the big decision you have to make as a company is, are you going to optimize for taking one code base and product, and optimizing for speed and taking that everywhere it will fit as it is? Or do you want to allow for adaptation and localization? And if so, that's going to come at the cost of speed, perhaps, but it's going to give you the benefit of being able to serve a greater proportion of the audience. So I think you have to pick where you want to be on that continuum. And then with that information, you have to make your estimate of what your addressable market really looks like, given where you are on that curve. And then you need to put, some real targets out there. A lot in any market, when you get started, it's up and to the right. And last quarter was significantly better than the previous one forever. And it becomes really hard to know, are you actually doing well or not? That's probably the hardest thing to know, unless things are going terribly, right? But otherwise, even if I remember when I first opened up a team in an office in China, things were going so much better than we could have expected. But the problem was we didn't really know, okay, well, our expectations were maybe too low, but how high should they be? And over time, we found out, well, actually, even though the business coming from the partner channel looks pretty good, it could have been, you look at a couple other companies and it's even higher over there. So I think knowing what good really should look like is the hardest thing to do when going into a new market.
That's fascinating also. Thank you. In business, the number one rule, normally the number one rule is not to anger your customers. And obviously you want to entice your customers, you want to make your customers happy. But in my personal experience, as a user of software, a lot of programmers don't seem to understand the rule that thou shalt not anger your customer. And they have errors that are so common that, they just create immense frustration. Like, step number one is step number one, go to this icon. Well, no, step number one is, where is this icon? Where on the keyboard, where on the screen is this icon? And then go to it. So I'm wondering, do software developers all drink from the same water cooler or something, that they all, not all of them, but many of them think the same way, and they think they're like programmers instead of like customers?
Yeah, so when you say that, there's a couple of things that I would wonder if are kind of contributing factors to this kind of experience. One is this a waterfall type of thing where somebody dreamed up what the product should do? It made sense to that one person. They handed it off. They built exactly what that person asked for, and it worked for them, and it didn't work for a lot of other people, including you. So, maybe that's why. And I think software companies need to be able to take feedback in when things are confusing, to detect that, and they need the capacity to actually act on it. But the problem, and I think that I'm guilty of this, is when you have a product that is being rolled out globally, you're going to hear feedback from a lot of different places, and sometimes that feedback is conflicting. What's confusing to one person is great for another, or it's just competing for a lot of other things in the product roadmap. And the challenge I had often was customers in China or customers in this one place, unlike every other place, this thing is really important to them. And if your headquarters and your product team is in the US and they haven't heard of those customers, and they've never seen that request ever before, it's really hard to get that thing prioritized. So I don't know if you, in your case, if you're the complaining customer from the region where their team is not located and they're just not very empathetic to your request, or if it was built via waterfall, by someone for whom that made perfect sense. But maybe it's a combination of both. But I think as a former product person, I can understand how that happens and empathize with it. But I think the best practice there is you've got to build in the ability to detect dissatisfaction, and then you've got to have the capability to improve the things that you're hearing are very broken for some people.
Do these companies normally test it, like with focus groups or something? I've been in a focus group for a software product, and I was delighted. It was wonderful. I felt how enlightened, but so many companies don't seem to do that.
Well, it's funny. When when I started my career, it was testing software. That's where usually they put you in when you're just fresh out of college. And yes, I think that every software is generally tested. Is it tested in, heavily and at scale and in multiple locations? Not usually, although I would say that again is a service. What used to be the thing that everybody had to do themselves has become a service. There's testing as a service, and hopefully those testing companies are running this in places like Japan, where there are a lot of particular needs around the way that things are displayed, and doing it in multiple cultures and all that sort of thing. But not every software company has the budget or the is truly best in class. But hopefully the best in class ones are doing, and the friends that I have that work at really big software companies, they have the budget, they have the awareness, and they have the skill to do good testing.
Yeah, well, that's why they're very large companies.
Indeed.
It all goes together. It also seems to be a common practice, at least in the United States, that companies have a predetermined launch date for their products and then sort of back up for that. But if the product is not fully tested or ready, they'll release it anyway, bugs and all, and then go back in the second and third iteration to correct the bugs. Whereas I think Europeans especially, they will not launch until the bugs are worked out. And so again, it creates a sense of service, customer service, and thinking from the client's point of view. Do you think that U.S. companies adopt different practices when releasing their software abroad, or do they tend to follow the U.S. practice of having a fixed start date and whatever is there is there?
I think the fixed start date or fixed kind of release date is often something you see with public companies, because they promise shareholders that they would have something out by Q2, and they're going to put it out there one way or the other. I think that that kind of constraint feels like a promise that's been made to someone, probably a shareholder, or to the market, or to a board. And of course, that's going to distort reality. It's rare or impossible that the date that was promised is the date that truly the product is in its best shape. If you're lucky, it falls right on the date, but in reality, it's going to be maybe before that date, or likely way after it. Things never go. I think that very rarely do you bake in enough time to your timelines that it's where you want it to be by the time that date rolls around. So I would say probably that's a public company scenario. And I think maybe there's just more acceptance for the fact that there's been a lot of companies and examples of software that was rolled out prematurely. We've seen that from the very biggest US companies, the Apples, the Teslas will even say, yeah, well, we had to hit the date for WWDC or whatever it was. And perhaps that's not as tolerable in other places. And one of the things that that reminds me of is when we were going into Japan, I was told by so many people that you only are going to get a first chance, or one chance to make a first impression there, right, and you cannot mess it up. And I think that's the kind of place where the last thing you want to do is be deadline specific and roll something out that's premature. And I think that maybe, coming back to your point, maybe in Europe too, it's a very bad look to try to take something that isn't fully baked out there. I think there's more tolerance for that sort of thing in the US.
Yeah, I think it's more German than other Europeans. Yes, it's very true. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I just really enjoy these types of discussions. I'm happy that you're building awareness for the terminology that we went through, and just sort of the best practices. You asked me a lot of questions about best practices I've seen. I'm sure that you guys come across a lot of best practices, and maybe the thing that we didn't talk about that, if there's listeners that are not as versed in this, I recently sat in on a localization and transcreation discussion, which I didn't know those terms very well.
Yes.
But the example they gave, which really opened my eyes, was and this gets to the point about what's the difference between translation and doing actually a proper job of, and I'm sure I'm butchering the term, but doing the content right for the context and the audience and the culture. And the example was Harley Davidson. And that a lot of the marketing message that is put out that we see in the US is around these ideas of freedom and open highways and this culture of rebellion. And of course, Harley Davidson is a company that wants to have their products everywhere. But if you did a masterful job of translating that campaign, and then you took that campaign into a place that doesn't have open highways, and there is no cultural resonance of rebellion, maybe rebellion is actually going to turn someone off,
Totally.
then that's going to fail, right? And I think that whatever company you are, you can probably translate that failure into your own context and what you're selling and the message that you might be putting out there that's just wrong. It's wrong for the people that you're giving it to. And I had this experience in Germany. The things that the message we were putting out were very aspirational, and they were very really tugging on your desire to be the best or something like that. And what we found out was really what we needed to be talking about was much more concrete, practical, data-driven messages, or else they're just not going to land. So I think coming back to your forte, getting that right is really next level. It's one thing to build in the plumbing. It's another thing to think long term about being international and global and what all that means. But when you're actually entering the market, you have to do a good job of not just getting the words right, but getting the message right within the local context. And I think that's where you guys are experts.
Yes, that's very true. First, that we're experts, yes. But secondly, and you use the word transcreation. This is a word that was invented by some geek in a language company. When I first heard it, I had absolutely no idea what it meant. And I never used the word in our company because it needs a translation by itself. Transcreation is, we use the word acculturation, which is a word from sociology that more people would understand. And it's exactly what you're talking about. This idea of Harley Davidson and the macho culture, that's perfectly fine in a country that like ours or Canada that has wide open spaces and huge highways. Those values, and they are ultimately values, do not work in other cultures that have totally different value systems. The other part of Harley Davidson, the motorcycle culture, is about the rugged individual. Well, being a rugged individual is very, very negative. Individualism is a very negative concept in a lot of cultures that are basically collective cultures where the group is much more important. And that, frankly, is most of the world. Certainly the Middle East, India subcontinent, East Asia, Africa, Latin America. Yes, when we have seen cases where people have translated their websites into English, and it's a translation from their language. Someone in their company translated it, who, as we say, Maria down the hall used to live there. Well, Maria down the hall translated it into American English, but it's totally wrong for the United States. It was totally wrong for the American culture. And similarly, companies need to be mindful that the cultural messages that resonate here do not necessarily resonate in the target country, and that's where the acculturation comes in. And that's where the software expertise comes in to make sure that not only do the characters fit, but do the concepts work. If you're talking something in Latin America, for example, there should be an emphasis on the family if it's a consumer product. If you're talking to Germans, as you said, it's something very, very practical, data-driven, factual, and so forth. And in Asia, again, it's absolutely not, it's about the group and the harmony of the group and how everyone can work together and so forth. So these are very critical issues that a lot of companies don't think about. And it's wonderful that your firm does. And it's great that you have the foresight to make those recommendations to your clients.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I just see so much these days and companies getting excited about generative AI, chat GPT, and can't we just have the this AI develop all of this copy. And I think that's the part that will be missing, at least in this early stage, if they take that approach.
Well, I hope these companies are wise enough to come to us, and we'll be delighted to fix it for them. So,
excellent.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful talk with Ramsey Pryor of Board of Entry Partners, and I'm Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International, and I hope you'll join us next week for another edition of Global Gurus and their stories of international business. Thank you.